Rifle's cold barrel pressed against Kestrel. Hawthorne's shoulder as he squinted through the driving rain at the 5 figures stumbling up his muddy path. Lightning split the Wyoming sky, illuminating their desperate faces for a heartbeat before plunging them back into darkness. His weathered hands tightened on the Winchester. 23 years of solitude had taught him that strangers meant trouble, especially when they appeared like ghosts in the worst storm he'd seen in a decade. "Please, mister." The voice that cut through the howling wind belonged to a young woman, barely visible beneath a soaked traveling cloak. "Our wagon broke down 3 miles back. We've been walking for hours." Kestrel's ice-blue eyes narrowed as he studied them from his covered porch. 5 women, all young, all traveling together without a man in sight. It reeked of deception. In 1887, respectable ladies didn't wander the frontier alone, especially not through Copper Ridge Valley, where his ranch sat like an island of civilization in an ocean of wilderness. "Turn around and head back to town," he called out, his voice rough from years of talking only to his horses. "Storm or no storm, I don't take in strangers." The tallest of the group stepped forward, water streaming from her auburn hair. "The town's 40 miles east, and our horses scattered when the wagon wheel snapped. If you turn us away, we'll die out here." Thunder crashed overhead, rattling the windows of his log cabin. Kestrel had built this place with his own hands after the war, after everything went wrong, after he decided human company brought nothing but pain. The isolation had been his salvation, his punishment, and his choice. But something in the redhead's voice struck him, not pleading or manipulation, just cold truth. They would die if he sent them back into this tempest. "Names," he barked, lowering the rifle slightly. "I'm Cordelia Brennan," the redhead answered without hesitation. "These are my traveling companions, Violet Ashworth, Magnolia Cross Iris, Fairchild, and Juniper Vale. We're bound for California." California. Everyone was bound for California these days, chasing gold or dreams or running from something. Kestrel knew about running from things. Another lightning strike illuminated their faces, clearly pale, exhausted but determined. No powder or rouge, no fancy dress beneath their practical traveling clothes. Whatever they were, they weren't. Saloon girls or confidence artists stood against every instinct screaming in his head. Kestrel stepped aside and jerked his thumb toward the door. "One night. Soon as the storm breaks, you're gone." Relief flooded their faces as they hurried past him, into the warmth of his cabin. The last one through a petite blonde with startling green eyes paused and looked directly at him. "Thank you, Mr. Hawthorne, Kestrel Hawthorne." The name felt strange on his lips. He hadn't spoken it aloud in years. "Thank you, Mr. Hawthorne. You may have just saved our lives." As he barred the door against the storm, Kestrel wondered if he'd just saved their lives or doomed his own carefully constructed solitude forever. The cabin fell into awkward silence, broken only by the storm's fury outside. Kestrel's sanctuary, unchanged for over 2 decades, suddenly felt cramped with 5 women dripping rainwater onto his worn wooden floors. The fireplace cast dancing shadows across walls lined with books, hunting trophies, and the accumulated solitude of a man who'd forgotten how to share space with other human beings. Cordelia Brennan surveyed the room with sharp hazel eyes that missed nothing. The loaded rifle mounted above the mantel, the medical texts mixed among novels on his shelves, the faded daguerreotype face down on the side table. "You're a doctor," she observed, wringing water from her cloak. "Was." Kestrel turned his back to them, busying himself with stoking the fire. "Long time ago." Violet Ashworth, a brunette with intelligent brown eyes, stepped closer to the bookshelf. "These are advanced surgical texts. Johns Hopkins, Harvard Medical College. You weren't just any doctor." The blonde Juniper Vale was studying the cabin's construction with obvious appreciation. This craftsmanship is extraordinary. You built this yourself, didn't you? Too many questions. Too much observation. Kestrel's jaw tightened as he grabbed towels from a chest, thrusting them at the women without meeting their eyes. There's a root cellar through that door with preserved food. Help yourselves. I'll sleep in the barn. Absolutely not. Cordelia's voice carried unexpected authority. This is your home, Mr. Hawthorne. We're grateful for shelter, but we won't drive you from your own bed. Magnolia Cross, a raven-haired woman with calloused hands that spoke of hard work, was already moving toward his small kitchen area. I can prepare something hot for everyone. It's the least we can do. Iris Fairchild, quiet until now with dark hair and observant gray eyes, spoke softly. We have money to pay for food and lodging, Mr. Hawthorne. We're not charity cases. Money. The word hit him like cold water. In 23 years, he'd needed little beyond what his small herd and garden provided. These women represented the outside world commerce, obligations, the civilization he deliberately abandoned. Keep your money. He settled into his chair. By the fire, the only piece of furniture large enough for his tall frame. Just ... stay quiet. I'm not used to voices. As Magnolia worked at his stove with surprising skill, the others arranged themselves around his small living space. They moved with practiced efficiency, clearly accustomed to making do in unfamiliar surroundings. But there was something else, an undercurrent of tension, quick glances toward the shuttered windows, the way Cordelia's hand never strayed far from a bulge in her traveling bag. You're running from something, Kestrel said suddenly. It wasn't a question. The women exchanged looks. Juniper bit her lower lip, while Violet's fingers drummed nervously against her skirt. Iris stared into the fire, and Magnolia's stirring slowed. Cordelia met his gaze directly. Aren't we all running from something, Mr. Hawthorne? The question hung in the air like smoke. Outside, the storm raged with renewed fury, rattling the shutters and moaning through the eaves. But inside, surrounded by lamplight and the smell of coffee brewing, Kestrel felt something he hadn't experienced in decades' curiosity about other people's stories. Tell me about California, he said gruffly, settling deeper into his chair. Cordelia smiled for the first time since arriving, transforming her face completely. What would you like to know? For the first time in 23 years, Kestrel Hawthorne discovered he wanted to know everything. The coffee Magnolia brewed was better than anything Kestrel had tasted in years, rich and perfectly balanced. As the storm continued its assault on the cabin, the women gradually relaxed, their wet clothes steaming in the fire's warmth. Against his better judgment, he found himself genuinely curious about these unexpected guests. We're teachers, Cordelia explained, settling cross-legged on his rug with surprising grace. Or rather, we were teachers back east. We've accepted positions at a new school in Sacramento. Violet laughed, a musical sound that made Kestrel's chest tighten with forgotten emotions. Accept is a generous word. We were more or less recruited by a very persistent benefactor who promised us adventure and proper salaries. Better than the alternative, Iris murmured, then caught herself. I mean, better than staying in our previous situations. Juniper's green eyes sparkled with mischief. What Iris means is that we were all desperately unhappy in our respectable positions, teaching spoiled children of wealthy families who cared more about appearances than education. Magnolia returned from the kitchen carrying a plate of beans and salt pork that somehow smelled appetizing despite the simple ingredients. We decided to take control of our own destinies. It seemed romantic at the time. And now? Kestrel asked, accepting the plate with a nod of thanks. Now we're sitting in a stranger's cabin in the middle of a Wyoming storm, questioning our life choices, Cordelia admitted with rueful honesty. The admission drew a sound from Kestrel. That might have been laughter if he'd remembered how I made my own dramatic life change once. Questioned it every day for the first 5 years. What made you choose this? Violet gestured around the cabin. It's beautiful here, but so isolated. Kestrel's fork paused halfway to his mouth. He'd avoided this question for over 2 decades, deflecting the few visitors who'd wandered this far from civilization. But something about these women, their own obvious flight from conventional lives, made the truth feel less dangerous. I was a surgeon in Chicago, he said finally. Had a practice, a fiancé, a fine house. Thought I was saving lives, making a difference. The women waited, sensing more to the story. The war changed everything. Spent 3 years putting men back together just so they could die a little slower. When I came home, he set down his fork, staring into the fire. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. Couldn't perform surgery anymore. Lost everything that mattered. Iris leaned forward. The shaking stopped eventually, though. Eventually. He flexed his fingers, steady as stone now. Too late for the life I'd planned. Cordelia's voice was gentle, but not too late for the life you chose. Outside, the wind howled like a living thing, but inside the cabin felt unexpectedly cozy. Kestrel realized he was comfortable for the first time in years, not just physically, but in some deeper way he'd forgotten existed. What about you? He asked. What are you really running from? The question hung in the air for a long moment. Then Magnolia spoke quietly. I was engaged to a banker's son in Boston. Discovered he'd been visiting other women. When I confronted him, he said it was natural for men that wives were for. Respectability and children. I was governess to a family in Philadelphia, Juniper added. The father decided I was part of his entitlements. When I refused him, he told everyone I was a thief. One by one, they shared their stories. Violet's battle with school administrators who refused to let her teach mathematics because it was unsuitable for a woman's mind. Iris's struggle as the sole support for her ailing mother until the woman's death left her alone and purposeless. Cordelia's discovery that her prestigious teaching position came with the expectation of warming the headmaster's bed. So we found each other, Cordelia concluded. 5 women with nothing left to lose and everything to gain. Kestrel studied. Their faces in the firelight determined, vulnerable, brave. California's a long way from here. Dangerous journey for anyone, let alone 5 women alone. We're not as helpless as we might appear, Iris said quietly, and something in her tone made Kestrel look at her more carefully. The storm was finally beginning to weaken. But none of them seemed eager for morning to come. Sleep eluded them all. The storm had diminished to a steady rain, but the cabin felt charged with something more than the lingering electricity in the air. Kestrel lay on his bedroll by the fire, staring at the ceiling while the women whispered softly from their makeshift beds. He'd given them his bedroom and settled by the hearth, but his mind raced with questions he hadn't allowed himself to ask in decades. Near midnight, soft footsteps approached. Cordelia settled beside the dying fire, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. In the amber glow, she looked younger than her earlier composure had suggested. Can't sleep either? She murmured. Kestrel propped himself up on one elbow. Not used to company. We're not used to kindness from strangers. She poked at the embers with an iron rod, sending sparks spiraling up the chimney. Most men would have demanded ... payment ... for shelter. The words hung heavy between them. Kestrel had known such men, had treated their victims during his Chicago days. Not all men are animals. No, but enough are that we've learned to be careful. She looked at him directly. You could have taken advantage 5 times over tonight. Instead, you gave us your bed and cooked food. Basic human decency. Rarer than you might think. Cordelia was quiet for a moment, studying his face. "There's something I need to tell you, something we should have mentioned earlier." Kestrel's stomach tightened. He'd known there was more to their story. "We're not just running toward California. We're running from someone specific." Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "A man named Bartholomew Grimm. He owns a string of establishments ... from Chicago to Denver. Places where women work under conditions that aren't quite slavery but aren't freedom either." The name meant nothing to Kestrel, but the fear in Cordelia's voice was unmistakable. "Grimm has been recruiting teachers, governesses, respectable women who've fallen on hard times. Promises them good positions, respectable work. By the time they realize the truth, they're trapped debt bondage, threats against family members, sometimes just physical force." Kestrel sat up fully now. "How did you five escape?" "We didn't escape. We never went with him in the first place." Cordelia's laugh was bitter. Juniper recognized his recruiters from descriptions in a letter from her cousin who disappeared 2 years ago. "We realized we were all being courted by the same organization." "So you ran?" "We ran, but Grimm doesn't give up easily. He sent men after us trackers, bounty hunters. We've been staying ahead of them for 3 weeks, but..." She gestured toward the window. "The storm forced us off the main trail. If they're following, they might lose our track. Or they might find this place." Kestrel felt something cold settle in his chest, not fear, but something harder and more familiar. The same feeling he'd had during the war when enemy cavalry appeared on the horizon. "How many men?" "We've seen 3 consistently. Could be more." Cordelia looked surprised by his calm tone. "Mr. Hawthorne, we never intended to bring danger to your door. If we'd known about the storm, how were you armed?" The question clearly wasn't what she'd expected. "I what?" "Firearms, knives. How are you prepared to defend yourselves?" Cordelia's eyes widened. "Iris has her father's old Navy Colt. Magnolia carries a Derringer. The rest of us have hope and determination." Kestrel was already standing, moving toward a chest in the corner of the room. "Hope and determination won't stop professional trackers." He opened the chest, revealing an arsenal that made Cordelia gasp softly. Multiple rifles, pistols, boxes of ammunition, and other items she couldn't identify in the dim light. 23 years of solitude teaches a man to be prepared for anything," he said grimly. "If Grimm's men are out there, they'll wait for daylight to approach. That gives us a few hours to prepare." "Us?" Cordelia's voice was barely audible. Kestrel met her eyes, and for the first time in decades, he felt genuinely alive. "No one threatens guests under my roof. Time to wake the others. You're about to learn that this lonely cowboy has more than cattle ranching in his past." Dawn approached with deceptive calm, the storm's fury replaced by an eerie stillness that made every sound seem amplified. Kestrel had transformed his peaceful cabin into a fortress, moving with military precision that revealed his true past to the 5 women watching in. Fascination and growing confidence. "I wasn't just a doctor during the war," he explained while checking the action on a Spencer repeating rifle. "I was a Union Army surgeon attached to special reconnaissance units. Cavalry raids behind Confederate lines. Had to learn to fight as well as heal." Violet Ashworth proved surprisingly adept with firearms, her mathematician's precision translating perfectly to marksmanship. "My father taught me to shoot before he died," she explained, sighting down the barrel of a Winchester. "Said a woman alone needed every advantage." Iris had been quiet about her Navy Colt, but when Kestrel tested her skills behind the cabin, her accuracy was remarkable. 6 shots, 6 bottles shattered at 50 yards. "My father was career military," she said simply. "He trained me like a son." Magnolia's experience with her derringer was limited, but her hands were steady, and Juniper showed natural talent with a lightweight carbine. Only Cordelia struggled with the weapons, her academic background providing little preparation. For violence. "I can't," she said, lowering a pistol with shaking hands. "I can't point this at another human being." "Then you'll be our intelligence," Kestrel decided. "Watch the approaches, coordinate our positions. Every battle needs a field commander." By full daylight, they were as ready as time allowed. Kestrel had positioned them at strategic points around the cabin, Violet in the loft with a clear view of the main trail, Iris covering the eastern approach from behind the woodshed, Magnolia watching the western flank from the root cellar entrance. Juniper remained inside with Cordelia, ready to provide covering fire through prepared loopholes in the shutters that the weight stretched their nerves taut. Then Violet's whistle from the loft, too short, one long signaled riders approaching from the south, 3 men, just as Cordelia had reported. They rode with the casual confidence of professionals, certain their quarry was helpless. The leader was a thick-set man with a carefully waxed mustache, flanked by 2 younger men who looked like they'd never missed a meal or a fight. They stopped 50 yards from the cabin, studying the peaceful scene. Smoke rising from the chimney. No signs of alarm. The leader smiled and urged his horse forward. "Hello, the cabin," he called out. "Name's Pike Morrison. We're looking for some runaway women. Thought you might have seen them." Kestrel appeared on his porch, Winchester held casually but ready. 23 years of isolation hadn't dulled his ability to read dangerous men. These 3 were killers, probably more accustomed to intimidating defenseless women than facing armed resistance. "Haven't seen any women," Kestrel replied calmly. "Just me and my cattle out here." Morrison's smile never wavered, but his eyes were scanning constantly, looking for signs of the women. "That's curious, friend. We tracked them to this valley before the storm hit. Footprints led right to your door. Storm washed out a lot of tracks. Could have led anywhere. Could have." Morrison nudged his horse closer. "Mind if we take a look around?" "Just to be thorough." Kestrel's grip on his rifle shifted almost imperceptibly. Around the cabin, 5 women held their breath and steadied their aim. "Actually, I do mind," Kestrel said quietly. "This is private property. You're welcome to water your horses and move on, but there's nothing here for you." Morrison's facade finally cracked. His hand moved toward his sidearm. "I think you're lying, friend. And I think you're harboring stolen property." "Stolen property?" Kestrel's voice carried new steel. "You mean 5 free women who chose to leave your employer?" The admission hung in the air like gun smoke. Morrison's smile became predatory. "So they are here. Makes this simple." He looked at his companions. "Search the cabin. Kill anyone who resists." "Bad choice," Kestrel said, and raised his Winchester. The battle for Cordelia's freedom was about to begin. The first shot came from Hobham. Morrison himself, his Colt clearing leather with practiced speed. But Kestrel had been expecting it, already dropping behind the porch railing as the bullet splintered wood where his chest had been. His return shot from the Winchester caught Morrison in the shoulder, spinning him sideways in his saddle. Chaos erupted across the yard. The 2 younger men Kestrel would learn later they were called. Briggs and Slade spurred their horses toward cover while drawing their weapons. But they hadn't accounted for 5 determined women with clear fields of fire. Violet's first shot from the loft took Briggs in the thigh, her mathematical precision evident even under pressure. The man screamed and tumbled from his horse, rolling behind a water trough for protection. Iris, positioned behind the woodshed with perfect cover, had a clear shot at Slade as he wheeled his horse toward the cabin's blind side. Her Navy Colt barked twice. The first shot spooked his horse, the second found its mark in his gun arm. Sweet Jesus. Slade shouted, nearly losing his seat as his horse reared in panic. "They're everywhere." Morrison, blood streaming from his wounded shoulder, managed to control his mount and put the barn between himself and Kestrel's rifle. "Briggs, how many are there?" "Can't tell." Briggs called back, pressure bandaging his wounded leg with a torn shirt. "Least 3, maybe more." From inside the cabin, Magnolia had positioned herself at a south-facing window while Juniper covered the north. Cordelia crouched between them, relaying positions and coordinating their defensive fire with hand signals Kestrel had taught them during their brief preparation. "Morrison's moving toward the barn," Cordelia called out. "Juniper, can you see him from your angle?" "Got him," Juniper replied, her earlier nervousness replaced by steely determination. She discovered something about herself in this moment of crisis, when her friends' lives depended on her accuracy. Her hands were stone steady. Her carbine cracked, sending Morrison diving for better cover as splinters exploded from the barn. Doorframe inches from his head. Slade, clutching his wounded arm, tried to circle around toward the root cellar where he hoped to find cover. He hadn't spotted Magnolia's position there, and his mistake cost him dearly. Her derringer wasn't accurate at long range, but when he stumbled into her carefully prepared ambush position, 15 feet was close enough. The small pistol's bark was almost insignificant compared to the rifle's, but its .41 caliber bullet dropped Slade like a stone. Clutching his chest and gasping for air, "Slade's down," Morrison shouted, his earlier confidence cracking. This was supposed to be a simple capture operation, 5 helpless women and perhaps one old rancher. Instead, they'd ridden into a coordinated ambush by people who clearly knew how to handle weapons. Briggs, still pinned behind the water trough, tried to return fire at Violet's position in the loft. But the young teacher had learned her lessons well during her brief training session. She'd prepared multiple firing positions and shifted between them, making her nearly impossible to target effectively. Her Winchester spoke again, and Briggs yelped as another bullet chewed wood fragments from his impromptu shelter. "Boss, these ain't helpless women. They're shooting like regulars." Morrison's wounded shoulder was stiffening up, making precise shooting difficult. But he was a survivor, and survivors knew when to change tactics. "Briggs, can you reach the horses?" "Maybe." "Why?" "We're pulling back." This was supposed to be easy. Money, not a damned siege. Kestrel, who had been methodically working his way around the barn's perimeter, suddenly appeared in the doorway behind Morrison. The bounty hunter spun at the sound of boots on straw, but he was too late. "Drop the gun," Kestrel said quietly, his Winchester centered on Morrison's chest. For a moment, Morrison considered fighting. Then he looked into Kestrel's eyes and saw something that made his decision easy. This wasn't some isolated rancher who'd stumbled into a situation over his head. This was a man who'd killed before and would do it again without hesitation if necessary. Morrison's Colt hit the barn floor with a metallic clatter. The sounds of battle faded, leaving only the heavy breathing of combatants and the moans of wounded men. The aftermath of violence always felt strange to Kestrel, the sudden quiet, the ringing ears, the way ordinary objects looked different when viewed through gun smoke. He kept Morrison covered while Cordelia and the others emerged from their positions, their faces showing the mixture of exhilaration and shock that came with surviving their first real fight. Briggs had passed out from blood loss behind the water trough. Slade was conscious but in serious condition, Magnolia's derringer having done more damage than her modest weapon might have suggested. Morrison stood with his hands raised, his shoulder wound bleeding steadily but not life-threatening. "Violet, Iris, secure their weapons," Kestrel ordered, falling back into the command voice he hadn't used in decades. "Magnolia, bring my medical bag from inside. We need to keep these men alive for questioning." The women moved with surprising efficiency, adrenaline having burned away any lingering hesitation. Juniper helped Cordelia gather the scattered firearms, while Violet and Iris worked together to tie up their prisoners with rope from Kestrel's barn. "You made a mistake, old man," Morrison said through gritted teeth as Kestrel examined his shoulder wound. "Grimm doesn't give up. He'll send more men. Then they'll end up like these three," Kestrel replied calmly, probing the bullet wound with practiced fingers. "Clean through, miss the bone. You'll live to face trial." Morrison laughed bitterly. "Trial? For what? Tracking stolen property? Grimm owns half the judges between here and Denver." Cordelia appeared at Kestrel's elbow with his medical supplies. "Then we'll take you to judges he doesn't own," she said firmly. "California has federal marshals who aren't for sale. You think you're free?" Morrison's eyes glittered with malicious amusement. "Grimm's got men everywhere. Saloon owners, merchants, even some lawmen. You five will never be safe, no matter how far you run." Iris looked up from bandaging Briggs' leg wound. "Maybe, but we won't be running alone anymore." The statement hung in the air as Kestrel worked to clean and dress Morrison's shoulder. The wounded bounty hunter looked between the grizzled rancher and the five determined women, understanding dawning on his face. "You're making another mistake," he warned. "Grimm will put prices on all your heads now. Big enough prices to bring every gun for hire from here to California." Kestrel finished bandaging the wound and stepped back. "Let him try. I've got plenty of ammunition and all the time in the world." But as he said the words, he realized they weren't entirely true anymore. For 23 years, time had been his enemy, endless, empty hours stretching toward a solitary grave. Now, suddenly, time felt precious again. These women had brought purpose back into his life, and purpose made every moment matter. Magnolia emerged from the cabin carrying a pot of coffee and tin cups. "I thought everyone could use this," she said, then looked at the three wounded prisoners. "Even them, if they want it." The gesture was so fundamentally decent that even Morrison looked surprised. In his world, winners took everything and losers got nothing. The concept of showing mercy to defeated enemies was foreign to him. "Why?" he asked, genuinely confused. "Because we're not like you," Cordelia said simply. "We don't want to become like you." Juniper had been studying their prisoners thoughtfully. "Mr. Morrison, how much is Grimm paying you for our capture?" $500 each, Morrison admitted. $2,500 total. "Dead or alive?" Morrison's hesitation was answer enough. Violet made a disgusted sound. "So we're worth more as corpses than as living people in his establishments." "Easier to transport," Morrison said with brutal honesty. "Less chance of escape." The words hit the women like physical blows. They'd known they were running for their freedom, but the casual way Morrison discussed their potential murder made the stakes crystal clear. Kestrel felt something dark and familiar stirring in his chest, the same feeling he'd had during the war when facing men who treated human life as a commodity to be bought and sold. "Change of plans," he said quietly. Night fell over the ranch with unusual beauty, stars emerging one by one in the clear post-storm sky. But inside the cabin, the atmosphere was tense with decision. Their three prisoners were secured in the barn, under Iris's watchful guard, while the others gathered around Kestrel's table to discuss their options. "We could head for the territorial capital," Violet suggested, spreading one of Kestrel's maps across the scarred wooden surface. "Turn these three over to federal authorities there." "That's 2 weeks hard travel," Kestrel replied, tracing the route with one finger. "Plenty of opportunity for Grimm's other men to catch up with us." Magnolia looked up from cleaning weapons with the methodical care she'd learned growing up on a farm. "What about the nearest town with a telegraph?" "We could wire ahead, arrange protection." Copper Creek, 40 miles east, Juniper said. But Morrison was right about one thing: Grimm has influence everywhere. Even a telegraph operator might be compromised. Cordelia had been unusually quiet, staring into the fire with a thoughtful expression. Finally, she spoke. There's another option. One we haven't discussed. The others turned to her expectantly. We stop running, she said simply. Silence greeted this statement. Then Violet laughed, but there was no humor in it. Cordelia, there could be a dozen more men coming after us. We can't fight an army, can't we? Cordelia looked around the table at her companions. Today we faced 3 professional gunmen and won. Not because we were lucky, but because we were prepared, organized, and fighting for something that mattered. Kestrel leaned back in his chair, studying Cordelia with new respect. What are you proposing? I'm proposing we make a stand. Here, on ground of our choosing, with time to prepare properly. Her voice gained strength as she spoke. Grimm's men are used to hunting frightened, isolated women. They're not prepared for organized resistance. Iris appeared in the doorway, having left their prisoners under Juniper's supervision. I couldn't help overhearing. You want to fight? I want to end this, Cordelia replied firmly. Even if we make it to California, Grimm will keep sending men. We'll spend our lives looking over our shoulders, never knowing when the next attack will come. Magnolia nodded slowly. She's right. Running just delays the inevitable. But if we eliminate enough of his hunters, Violet said, understanding dawning in her voice, eventually it becomes too expensive for Grimm to continue. Kestrel found himself impressed by their tactical thinking. These women had adapted to violence with disturbing ease, but their reasoning was sound. Running from a persistent enemy while burdened with prisoners would likely lead to disaster. It would mean giving up California, he pointed out. The teaching positions, the new life you planned, would it? Cordelia's eyes brightened. Mr. Hawthorne, you mentioned having medical texts. Are there children in this territory who need education? Understanding struck him like lightning. You want to stay here. Why not? This valley is beautiful, defensible, and far enough from major settlements to offer privacy. You've proven a man can make a good life here. Juniper returned from the barn, catching the end of the conversation. Stay and fight? I'm tired of running, tired of being afraid. If these are our options, I choose to stand and face them. One by one, the others nodded agreement. They'd found something in this isolated valley, not just safety, but purpose. The frightened women who'd stumbled through Kestrel's door in last night's storm were gone, replaced by people who discovered their own strength. Kestrel looked around. The table had 5 determined faces illuminated by lamplight. For 23 years, he'd lived with the consequences of one terrible choice made during the war, a choice that had cost lives and destroyed his faith in himself. Now another choice lay before him, equally dangerous but somehow feeling right in a way nothing had for decades. Grimm will send more men, he warned them. Then we'll be ready, Cordelia replied. It means killing, not just defending ourselves, but actively hunting men who come hunting us. Then that's what we'll do, Kestrel nodded slowly. All right. If we're doing this, we do it right. Military planning, proper fortifications, coordinated tactics. This ranch becomes a fortress, and we become an army. Outside, the wind whispered through the valley with a sound like distant promises. Inside, 6 people committed themselves to a war that would determine whether freedom could be won through courage, and whether a lonely cowboy's empty life could be filled with purpose once more. The battle for their future was about to begin in earnest. 3 months later, the valley had transformed beyond recognition. What began as Kestrel Hawthorne's solitary ranch had become a thriving community, built around the principle that some things were worth fighting for. The morning sun illuminated new construction, a schoolhouse where Cordelia taught the children, of 3 families who'd settled nearby, drawn by stories of the Hawthorne Stand and the promise of protection from predators both human and animal. Violet had established a small library and taught advanced mathematics to anyone interested. Her precision with numbers had proven as valuable as her marksmanship during the siege that followed. Morrison's capture. Grimm had indeed sent more men, 12 in total, over the past 3 months. None had returned to report their failure. Word had spread through the criminal underworld that the Hawthorne Valley was death to bounty hunters and slavers. The price on the women's heads had been quietly withdrawn after Grimm lost more money on failed expeditions than he could ever hope to recover. Iris ran the valley's unofficial medical practice alongside Kestrel, her steady hands and calm demeanor making her a natural healer. The combination of his knowledge and her intuitive skill had saved 2 lives during a difficult childbirth and treated countless injuries from the growing community's construction projects. Magnolia had discovered a talent for organizing that went far beyond cooking. She coordinated supply runs, managed the growing correspondence with territorial authorities, and had somehow convinced a circuit judge to make the valley a regular stop on his rounds. Her Derringer had been replaced by a more practical rifle. Though she'd kept the small pistol for sentimental reasons, Juniper's carpentry skills had blossomed under Kestrel's guidance. Together, they'd built not just the schoolhouse but also a trading post, expanded living quarters, and defensive positions that looked like innocent farm buildings but could stop a small army. Her green eyes still held their mischievous sparkle, but now they also carried the confidence of someone who'd found her true calling. The 3 captured bounty hunters had been turned over to federal authorities and were currently serving lengthy sentences for kidnapping and attempted murder. Their testimony had exposed enough of Grimm's operation to cripple his recruiting efforts across 3 territories, but the most remarkable transformation was in Kestrel himself. The hollow-eyed recluse who'd nearly turned away 5 desperate women had become the beating heart of a community. His medical practice served families from 50 miles around. His tactical expertise had trained a citizen militia that kept the peace across the region. And his cabin had expanded into a proper ranch house with room for the extended family he'd never expected to have. On this particular morning, he stood on his expanded porch watching Cordelia ring the school bell, calling her students to their lessons. The sound echoed across the valley like a promise of civilization taking root in wilderness. "Penny for your thoughts," Magnolia said, joining him with 2 cups of coffee. "Just thinking about how quiet it used to be here," Kestrel replied, accepting the cup gratefully. "Amazing how much I don't miss the silence." Across the yard, Violet emerged from the trading post with a ledger under her arm, calling out calculations to Juniper, who was measuring lumber for another expansion project. Iris appeared in the doorway of what everyone now called the clinic, wiping her hands on an apron after treating a rancher's infected wound. "Any regrets?" Magnolia asked quietly. Kestrel considered the question seriously. His life had been simpler before that storm-lashed night, certainly more predictable. But simple wasn't the same as good, and predictable wasn't the same as meaningful. "Not a one," he said finally. "What about you? Ever think about those teaching positions in California?" Magnolia laughed, the sound bright and warm in the morning air. "California's got plenty of teachers. But there's only one Hawthorne Valley, and only one stubborn cowboy who needed 5 strange women to teach him that isolation isn't the same as peace." From the schoolhouse, children's voices rose in recitation, mixing with the sounds of construction, conversation, and commerce. The valley thrived with the kind of life Kestrel had forgotten was possible: messy, complicated, demanding, and absolutely worth fighting for. That evening, as was their custom, the 6 original residents gathered around the expanded dining table. for dinner and discussion. The conversation ranged from mundane matters of supply and construction to philosophical debates about justice, community, and the nature of freedom. "I received a letter today," Cordelia announced as Iris served apple pie made from their own orchard. "From a group of women in Denver. They're facing similar difficulties with organized predators." Kestrel looked up from his dessert. "Looking for advice? Looking for help? Active help." The table fell quiet as the implications sank in. They'd found peace in their valley, built something beautiful and lasting. But beyond their borders, other women still faced the horrors they'd escaped. Violet was the first to speak. "How many women?" 17. "Mostly teachers and shopkeepers. The local authorities have been unresponsive to their complaints." Juniper set down her fork. "When do we leave?" It wasn't really a question, and they all knew it. They'd found more than safety in Hawthorne Valley. They'd found purpose. And purpose, once discovered, demanded action. Kestrel looked around the table at 5 women who'd become sisters, partners, and the family he'd never thought he'd have. The lonely cowboy who'd lived alone for years was gone, replaced by a man who understood that some fights were worth starting and some causes were worth any risk. 2 weeks to prepare, he said finally. "We'll leave the valley in good hands and finish what we started." Cordelia smiled, the same expression of determination that had marked her face during their first battle. "Together?" "Always together," Kestrel replied. Outside, the valley settled into peaceful night, secure in the knowledge that its protectors would return. And somewhere in Denver, 17 frightened women would soon discover that help was coming in the form of a reformed cowboy and 5 teachers who'd learned that the best lessons were sometimes taught at gunpoint.